Welcome to the Jacksonville Historical Society's History Show, a regular monthly taping of stories about our local history. All our history has stories behind it, whether it's structures or people or families. And today our two speakers, Pat Patillo and Mrs. O'Stryker, are here to tell a story about, in the first case, some buildings, some churches, and in the second case, about a family. Pat Patillo, our first guest. Welcome, Pat. I'm glad you're here.
Thank you, Jerry.
Pleasure to be here. Pat is a native of Tampa. He's practiced architecture here in Jacksonville for the past 40 years and has a lifelong interest in church architecture. That interest in a particular kind of church, the river churches that the Episcopalians built right after the Civil War, led you to a story about the churches, about the gentleman in the Civil War, and a lost treasure. Tell us about this book.
Well, I think maybe, Jerry, I ought to explain to you how I got interested in churches. I had a small architectural firm, and we did the usual apartments and condominiums and restaurants and clubs and houses for some very select clients, but we did a variety of churches, and that's what got me interested in the churches. And I became interested in particular in what is called in Jacksonville the river churches, or some people refer to them as Carpenter Gothic. And I wondered where that description came from and why and how these marvelous little buildings were built. And I did some research, and I found that there were 18 of these buildings. And I was quite excited to find that many. They grew out of missionary desire of the first bishop of Florida, a man named Rutledge. And because Florida was so much of a wilderness, he limited his missionary zeal going west, and he only went as far south as Palatka. And he was instigated in building a church there, St. Mark's, which is the earliest of the so-called river churches in Florida. His successor was a man named John Young, and John Young was elected bishop in 1867, and his zeal followed the steamboats as they went up and down the river, bringing tourists and sportsmen and staples as they went south. And the tourists and the sportsmen got interested in the beautiful flora that we know along the river, and the visitors included Episcopal clergymen, and pretty soon they were having services, and Bishop Young was astute enough to establish missions up and down the river. And I think it'd be interesting that for most of the audience to learn where these churches were. I'd like to start at the ocean, and they would, it's amazing to me that we would have churches in Pablo Beach, Fort George, Fulton, Chaseville, New Berlin, Arlington, Orange Park, Mandarin, Hibernia, Green Cove Springs, Palatka, Federal Point, Willaca, Crescent City, and Enterprise. Now, 5 of these churches are no longer with us, and there are 12 that were built. They're all somewhat alike. Bishop Young had a beginnings in New York at Trinity Church, and he had a good friend named Richard Upjohn. And Mr. Upjohn, after his success in New York with Trinity, was invited to design churches all up and down the East Coast. And he was so besieged with designing churches that he published a book called Rural Architecture. And when Bishop Young was elected Bishop of Florida, he brought this book with him to demonstrate his belief in what a church should look like. And many of the churches, they don't all look alike, but they have details that are somewhat similar. They have...
Pat, would this be a good time to take a look at this?
Okay.
Let's see.
These churches are all about 1,000 square feet. The churches are wood frame. They have a board siding, a vertical board siding that is joined together with a very unique triangular shaped batten. And the uniqueness of this batten was one of the things that I became interested into, how all these little wonderful buildings were built. As you can see from the pictures, they have steeply sloping roofs, an occasional belfry. They have pointed windows, and they're all on a brick foundation. This church in Orange Park, for example, Grace Church. Here is the first one in Florida, St. Mark's in Palatka. This is Federal Point. This is St. Mary's in Green Cove Springs. All of these churches were built during the age of the steamboats. And as the steamboats went up and down the river, the missions grew. And as the missions grew, I became more and more interested in the story about how these little buildings were built. They were built, as I said, of a wood frame. Here is the samples of the pictures of St. Margaret's in Hibernia. This is a marvelous place to visit. It is, I guess you'd say, the closest to downtown Jacksonville. If you go past Orange Park, you turn off of US 17 onto Church Road and go to the river. And this marvelous little building is located on a dirt road under the oak trees. And there's just a gorgeous, gorgeous setting. There's a cemetery behind it. And the building is so wonderfully restored and kept that it is astonishing to me.
Pat, when the bishop came to Florida to do the churches, did he use native materials? Did he have his book and he used native materials, cedar, part pine?
No, most of the materials are vertical pine. If you look in Upjohn's book, the foundations were somewhat different. But in Mr. Upjohn's book, he was so detailed that he had elevations and floor plans and sections and even outline specifications for the building. And what intrigued me is that Bishop Young had an influence in all these buildings, but he used other architects. A man named Charles Height, for example. He did St. Mary's in Green Cove. An architect named Richard Schuyler. He did St. George, Grace Orange Park, St. Paul's by the Sea, which is now on Florida Avenue. And the other man named Height, he did St. Mary's in Green Cove, as I described. The immensity of this man's project and his work over the years is what was intriguing to me, is why and how he built these little churches. And as I read in the research of these books, I began to want to know more about the river. And the river intrigued me so much, and I wanted to learn more about the river. And then that led me to learning more about the legends and the stories of things that happened in Jacksonville. There's so many wonderful things that happen in our community that many people don't know about. And I wanted to tell in my book all I could about these occurrences. The book started out to be a guidebook of the little churches, and I thought I had something, and I wanted to know more about the little churches. And I drew pictures and took photographs and all like that, and the river kept poking up, and I wanted to know about the river. So I went up the river with the river keeper, and that was intriguing. And then I wanted to know about the people, all this that was happening during the Civil War. And I got interested in what happened in Jacksonville. One thing that immediate is that the visit of Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee came to Jacksonville, and a lot of people don't know that. He came after the war. He was in poor health, and he came to Jacksonville, didn't get off of the boat, actually was taken up the river and visited a good friend there, where he was shown a product that this man was developing, and he named it after the way the fruit grow, and it was grapefruit.
Well, Pat, all of that led you to mix architecture with history, with a mystery, and the river. Yep. And that's when you wrote the book, St. Dunstan's and John.
And John, right.
And that pertains to a great legend dealing with the Civil War's treasury.
Well, that was the glue that my guidebook turned into a novel, because I really wanted to be able to give voice and dialogue and character to these people that I met in my studies, Bishop Young, Richard Upjohn, and some of the people that lived on the river. And the glue was the treasure of the Confederacy. I found that the treasure disappeared as it came as far south as Gainesville, and from Gainesville it disappeared into legend. and that's where my book took over, and that's what I've had a lot of fun writing about, is the legend of the treasure of the Confederacy.
Did you have a lot of help with that book from local folks?
Oh yes, yes. I had help from the Jacksonville Historical Society.
Thank you.
And the Matheson Museum in Gainesville. And I even got so interested, I went to the Museum of the Confederacy in Richmond.
Right.
And other places that were a lot of help to me. And that's what I enjoyed the most, was the research into learning about the Confederate gold. And that's what's the basis of my book, really, is the search for the Confederate gold.
Well, Pat, I'm extraordinarily interesting, and I know many people will want to read the book. But on Thursday, January the 29th, it will be the honor of the Jacksonville Historical Society to have you as our guest speaker. Our history program for January begins at 7 o'clock that evening, and the public is very much welcome in that. We would really like to invite all of you to attend. The Old St. Andrews Church is on A. Philip Randolph Boulevard near the baseball stadium. You're certainly all welcome. Pat, I appreciate you being here today, and we look forward to the crowd joining us on Thursday the 29th. Now, please stay tuned for the next session. Our Executive Director, Emily Liska, will be interviewing Mrs. Ostreicher concerning the history of her family in the rural North Florida right after the Civil War, the same period Pat is on. Thank you very much.